A brief clash near Avdiivka resulted in the destruction of at least 2 Russian armored vehicles, the disabling of 1 tank, and several Russian infantry groups being pinned down in open terrain. The engagement did not involve a large-scale offensive, nor did it lead to any immediate territorial changes. However, it provides a useful case study of how combat dynamics on the Donetsk front may be evolving. Ukrainian forces appear to be placing increased emphasis on short, mobile actions designed to strike quickly, withdraw, and then re-engage before opposing units can reorganize. In the Avdiivka area, elements of Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade employed Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in a sequence of operations that may have appeared high risk, but were structured around careful timing and coordination. The significance of the clash lies less in the number of Russian vehicles lost and more in how Ukrainian units integrated reconnaissance, armored mobility, and unmanned aerial systems. This coordination forced Russian units into a reactive posture, despite Russia's continued advantage in artillery and overall troop numbers in the area. According to available assessments, Russian responses tended to occur after Ukrainian units had already achieved their immediate objectives, increasing the cost of each counteraction. If similar engagements continue, Avdiivka could increasingly illustrate how pressure on the Donetsk front is being applied incrementally rather than through a single decisive breakthrough. This raises a broader question frequently discussed by military analysts, whether such actions represent isolated tactical engagements or the early signs of a more consistent operational approach. Avdiivka remains strategically important because of its location. Situated directly adjacent to Donetsk city, it has long served as a contact zone where front lines intersect with dense urban and industrial terrain. As a result, even limited movements around Avdiivka tend to carry wider operational and political implications. From the Russian perspective, progress in this area could help reduce Ukrainian artillery pressure on Donetsk and improve the security of rear areas. Control or advancement near Avdiivka may also shorten supply lines and stabilize nearby positions, making it a symbolically and operationally sensitive objective. Ukraine's assessment of Avdiivka differs. Rather than treating the area solely as terrain that must be held indefinitely, Ukrainian planners appear to view it as a zone where Russian advances can be delayed, redirected, and made costly through repeated localized engagements. This helps explain why the area continues to see intense fighting even in the absence of large-scale offensives. The terrain reinforces this approach. Avdiivka is surrounded by industrial sites, tree lines, trench systems, and open approaches that constrain large formations while favoring units capable of rapid movement and quick decision-making. In this environment, numerical superiority alone offers limited advantage. Timing, coordination, and control over short distances become more decisive. Russian units operating in the sector face a persistent dilemma. Pausing risks exposure to surveillance and indirect fire, while advancing too quickly can lead into prepared engagement zones where movements are already tracked. Analysts note that the margin for effective action is narrow, and delays or misjudgments often result in losses that are difficult to conceal or replace. Ukrainian forces appear to be adapting by focusing on shaping Russian decision-making, rather than holding every position continuously. Instead of attempting to block all advances, they aim to force Russian commanders into repeated choices that consume time, equipment, and momentum. Each attempt to probe or reinforce becomes a potential point of attrition rather than clear progress. This approach does not rely on permanent control of every trench. It depends on situational awareness, rapid deployment of mobile units, and disciplined disengagement once objectives are achieved. Avdiivka's terrain and density of contact make it particularly suited to this method, which helps explain why it remains contested after years of fighting. The result is a front line that experiences frequent engagements but few dramatic shifts. Pressure accumulates through repeated encounters in which movement itself carries risk. This is why Avdiivka continues to attract attention from military observers, and why even limited clashes there are often interpreted as indicators of broader trends. The initial phase of the recent engagement highlights how timing and awareness can shape an outcome before direct contact begins. Ukrainian units relied on drone reconnaissance to monitor roads, tree lines, and potential firing positions well in advance. This allowed commanders to assess Russian artillery activity and identify brief periods when targeting data was incomplete. The decision to advance was made during such a window. Once Bradley vehicles moved forward, their movement was controlled and deliberate using terrain, features, and structures to limit exposure. This reduced the time available for Russian observers to confirm targets and relay corrected coordinates to artillery units. At the dismount point, infantry exited the vehicles quickly and dispersed in multiple directions. This minimized vulnerability to concentrated fire and avoided delays that could be exploited by incoming artillery. Each team moved with defined tasks and limited distances to cover, maintaining momentum. Russian artillery responded shortly after the dismount was detected, but incoming fire was dispersed and uneven, suggesting that targeting adjustments were still underway. Explosions impacted open ground and unoccupied areas, rather than the exact infantry dismount locations. This pattern suggests that Russian artillery crews were firing based on general movement indicators rather than confirmed coordinates from real-time spotting. While the fire was intense and visually significant, its tactical effect was limited. For Ukrainian infantry, the first seconds of this phase were critical. As shells landed off target, units continued moving instead of stopping or withdrawing. The noise and smoke from the impacts were used as temporary concealment, allowing teams to close distance toward trenches and suspected firing positions. Each step taken during this window reduced the effectiveness of delayed artillery adjustments. From the Russian perspective, the situation became increasingly constrained. Once Ukrainian infantry moved out of open terrain, further artillery corrections risked striking friendly forces or expending ammunition without effect. The opportunity to disrupt the action early had passed. Military analysts often note that in modern engagements, outcomes are frequently shaped before sustained exchanges of fire begin. Control of observation and timing can reduce even heavy firepower to limited utility. At this stage, Ukrainian units did not require artillery dominance. Their immediate objective was to gain sufficient time to move into covered positions and force the engagement into closer terrain. By the time Russian gunners could refin targeting data, the situation on the ground had shifted. Infantry elements were dispersed under cover and preparing for subsequent actions. What appeared to be a brief forward movement was, in effect, a measured advance guided by situational awareness rather than speed alone. These opening moments did not determine the entire outcome, but they removed Russia's best chance to halt the action early and allowed the fight to proceed on terms more favorable to Ukrainian forces. The next phase revealed difficulties faced by Russian armored units once the engagement moved into close range. As Ukrainian infantry consolidated forward positions, Russian commanders committed reinforcements in an effort to regain control. Two BTR-82A armored personnel carriers advanced along a direct route at high speed, indicating a focus on rapid arrival rather than maneuver or protection. While this reduced transit time, it also limited flexibility once the vehicles were committed to the approach. Ukrainian Bradley crews detected the movement early and shifted their attention toward the advancing armor. At close range, the Bradley vehicles did not require aggressive maneuvering, as the targets were already exposed. Direct fire was applied accurately, disabling the first BTR almost immediately. Smoke and fire marked the impact point, and the vehicle's movement stopped within seconds. The second BTR followed the same route and encountered the same conditions before its crew could react or deploy. Infantry under cover, it was also struck and disabled. What was intended as a reinforcement push resulted instead in the rapid loss of two armored vehicles. Analysts frequently point out that linear movement under observation can turn speed into a liability rather than an advantage. With both carriers neutralized, Russian infantry in and around the vehicles were forced into the open. Lacking mobile protection, soldiers dispersed across exposed ground in search of available cover. At this point, organized movement gave way to individual survival, sharply reducing the ability to coordinate follow-on actions. Simultaneously, another engagement developed along a nearby axis. A Bradley operating in a supporting role identified an armored target at close range. After confirmation, an anti-tank missile was launched, striking the vehicle before it could reposition or employ its weapons. This further reduced Russian armored presence in the area. Additional Russian infantry fighting vehicles were observed in static or semi-static positions. Direct fire from Bradley vehicles was used to engage these targets, and at least one BMP was destroyed during the exchange. Each loss eased pressure on Ukrainian infantry and complicated Russian efforts to stabilize the situation. What defined this phase was not volume of fire, but sequencing. Russian armored units entered the engagement after Ukrainian forces had already established observation and favorable engagement angles. By the time reinforcements arrived, conditions no longer allowed for safe deployment or effective support. The engagement highlighted broader challenges for armored platforms operating without coordinated support, smoke, or layered protection. In such conditions, vehicles designed to transport infantry rapidly can become vulnerable once detected. The final phase demonstrated a clear difference in tactical priorities after immediate objectives were met. Rather than attempting to hold ground indefinitely, Ukrainian commanders emphasized mobility and force preservation. Disengagement was treated as an active and planned part of the operation, not a sign of retreat. Bradley vehicles played a central role during this withdrawal. Instead of leaving immediately, they maintained controlled fire toward known Russian firing areas, limiting pursuit and disrupting reorganization efforts. This created a protected corridor that allowed infantry to reposition in stages, maintaining spacing and command control. The movement was deliberate and sequential, reducing confusion under pressure. Russian forces attempted to disrupt the withdrawal with anti-tank weapons and indirect fire. In one instance, a Bradley maneuvered sharply after detecting a missile threat, changing speed and direction to avoid a direct hit. Shortly afterward, mortar rounds landed nearby, but the vehicle had already repositioned. These actions reflected trained responses based on anticipation and rapid decision-making. Another Bradley E experienced a different outcome during the same phase. It sustained multiple hits that damaged its mobility and forced it to stop. Despite the loss of movement, the crew remained protected inside the vehicle, and no fatalities were reported at that time. The damaged Bradley did not become a static loss. A third vehicle moved in quickly to recover the crew and withdraw under cover. This sequence illustrates why survivability remains significant, even when a platform is no longer operational. While a disabled vehicle is often recorded as a loss, preserving trained personnel retains combat capability beyond the loss of equipment. In this case, the successful extraction prevented a tactical setback from becoming a personnel loss. During the withdrawal, Ukrainian units avoided allowing the disengagement to turn into a pursuit. Fire from Bradley vehicles remained controlled and selective, focused on denying movement rather than inflicting maximum damage. The objective was to hold space only long enough to complete the withdrawal, then disengage before Russian forces could coordinate an effective response. Russian units faced difficulty exploiting the situation. Without intact armored support and under continued observation, attempts to advance carried elevated risk. Each movement exposed positions to return fire, which discouraged aggressive pursuit and slowed decision-making. Military analysts frequently note that modern combat does not end when contact breaks. Withdrawal phases can be as complex and dangerous as initial engagement. Errors during disengagement often result in greater losses than the opening exchange. Ukrainian forces approached this phase deliberately, using training and equipment to manage risk rather than attempting to hold ground for symbolic value. The result was an organized disengagement that preserved personnel and remaining equipment while maintaining pressure on opposing forces. Rather than a retreat under fire, the withdrawal reinforced control over tempo. In engagements measured by minutes and limited distances, that control can be more decisive than holding a single position. Pressure did not end with withdrawal. Ukrainian commanders treated the pause as a reset rather than a break in activity. After pulling back from immediate contact, forces resumed shaping the area through coordinated use of armored vehicles, drones, and observation. Bradley vehicles operated alongside Abrams tanks, combining mobility, protection, and firepower within a confined battle space. This pairing allowed Ukrainian units to threaten multiple directions while remaining difficult to fix in place. As these formations maneuvered, FPV drones operated overhead and along likely approach routes. Their role extended beyond strike missions to persistent surveillance of roads, open terrain, and damaged tracks where reinforcements might attempt to move. When Russian vehicles attempted to advance, drones either guided fire or conducted direct attacks. The pause had a difficult balance. Concentrating forces increased vulnerability to detection, while dispersing reduced the ability to mount effective counteraction. Attempts to reinforce exposed sectors often triggered drone activity that slowed or halted movement before contact occurred. Over time, this dynamic made regaining initiative increasingly costly. BR. A notable feature of this phase was restraint. Ukrainian forces did not attempt a dramatic breakthrough or seek to hold forward ground overnight. Instead, they focused on maintaining local advantage through repeated pressure that stayed below the threshold of a large-scale offensive. This approach preserved combat power while keeping opposing forces under sustained strain. Around Avdiivka, the fight became less about fixed lines on a map and more about controlling options. Each Russian movement carried risk, while Ukrainian forces retained flexibility in when and where to apply force. This balance allowed continued activity without escalating into a costly operation. In this context, pressure functioned as a sustained tool rather than a single event. By combining armored maneuver and drone activity after withdrawal, Ukrainian units ensured that fighting did not pause. It shifted in form, slowed in tempo, and remained unpredictable, allowing local control without requiring large commitments. The engagements near Avdiivka did not produce an immediate or dramatic shift in front lines. However, they illustrate how the rhythm of comb on the Donetsk front may be changing. Rather than relying on static defense or large offensives, Ukrainian units are conducting rapid engagements, withdrawing with control, and returning before opposing forces can fully recover. Military observers note that this approach turns time into a key factor. Each response arrives later, costs more resources, and resolves fewer challenges. The issue becomes not only replacing damaged equipment or deploying additional troops, but responding to a style of fighting where reaction speed and coordination matter as much as firepower. Artillery and manpower remain important, but they cannot fully compensate for delayed coordination or predictable movement under constant observation. If this pattern continues, engagements around Donetsk may be shaped less by major offensives and more by repeated moments in which one side controls tempo and choice. That uncertainty is why Avdiivka remains a focal point. Whether these engagements represent isolated clashes or the early stages of a broader shift in how the front is contested remains an open question. For continued reporting and analysis on modern warfare, battlefield developments, and military strategy, consider following the channel.